All right, guys, welcome back to Underground Science. In this video, we'll be talking about autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome. Okay, so let's go and get started. So first, before we talk about the findings, we need to understand how this works, right? So the cause is an autosomal recessive mutation in the AIR gene. Okay, and we'll see why the AIR gene is important, right? In a bit. So let's start talking about the pathophysiology. So remember, right? T cells initially, right? They start to get made. They're made in the bone marrow, but to mature, where do they go? They go to the thymus, right? Part of their maturation process is positive and negative selection, right? Remember that from immunology. We need these T cells to undergo positive and negative selection so that these T cells don't attack our self tissues, right? So what happens is in the thymus gland, right, we have the cortex and we have the medulla. Those are two different sections. In the cortex, we have positive selection. Okay. So in the cortex, we have positive selection. In the medulla, we have negative selection. So let's go through what positive selection is and how that works. So again, where does positive selection occur? In the cortex of the thymus gland. Okay, and remember, these are the T cells that are undergoing positive selection, right? The developing T cells, the thymocytes. So what happens is in the cortex, you have something called cortical thymic epithelial cells. Okay, you have cortical thymic epithelial cells in the cortex of the thymus gland. That's why they're called cortical thymic epithelial cells. These epithelial cells, what they do is they have MHC on them, right? Whether that's one or two, and they present an antigen, right? But what happens is that remember you have thymocytes or the developing T cells that are also in the cortex. Okay. So again, right? We already mentioned this, but remember, in the cortex of the thymus gland, you have cortical thymic epithelial cells. Okay, and again, in the cortex, you have positive selection. Now, the whole point of positive selection is, can our immature T cells recognize our own MHC complexes, right? Because remember, like T cells in general, when fighting infections, they need to be able to recognize MHC1 and MHC2, right? Because, like, for example, if an antigen presenting cell presents an antigen on MHC2, your T cells need to be able to recognize the MHC2, right, with its CD4. And if there's a virus or something else infecting our cells, right, our CD8 cells, for example, need to recognize MHC1. So that's what positive selection is for. Do our T cells recognize our MHC complexes? If they do, good, right? If they don't, destroy them, right? Because they're not going to be any good when they actually become functional T cells, like fully mature T cells. So, so what happens is in your cortex of your thymus gland, you have cortical thymic epithelial cells that have MHC1 or 2, right, on its cell surface. And this thymic cortical epithelial cells is presenting a self-antigen, right, a self-peptide. And your immature T cells, they have a T cell receptor and they have both CD4 and CD8 on their cell surface. Now, if these cortical thymic epithelial cells, for example, right, have MHC2 on their surface, and the CD4 protein binds here on the MHC2, then this T cell will go on and become a CD4 helper T cell. Now, if this cortical thymic epithelial cell has a MHC1, right, with a self-antigen, and the immature T cell, the CD8 protein on the immature T cell binds the MHC1, then of course this T cell will go on to become a CD8 helper T cell. Okay, so if you recognize the MHC, right? So of course the TCR will weakly bind here. It should weakly bind, right? Because you don't want strong binding to your self antigen because that's also bad. So you should have weak binding between the TCR and the self MHC. And most importantly, your CD4 or CD8 should recognize MHC, right? So it should properly recognize MHC. if your immature T cells recognize MHC, your T cells survive, right? And if you have weak binding between your T cell receptor and the self antigen in MHC, right, your T cells survive. If your T cell receptors, if your immature T cells, I should say, do not recognize MHC, then apoptosis occurs. Okay, so that's the job of that's the result of positive selection. Do our immature T cells recognize our own MHC complexes? If they do, good, they go on to negative selection. If they don't, they undergo apoptosis. Now let's see what happens in negative selection. So that was positive selection. Negative selection occurs in a different part of the thymus gland, specifically the medulla of the thymus gland, not the cortex. So in the cortex, we had cortical thymic epithelial cells. In the medulla, we have medullary thymic epithelial cells. Now, these medullary thymic epithelial cells, right, they also have MHC on their surface and they present self-antigen, right? So what do I mean by self-antigen? Of course, that self-antigen can be your antigens from your entire body, right? So it can be insulin, for example, or 21 hydroxylase, right, from your adrenal glands, or myelin basic protein, right? Or retinal proteins or salivary gland antigens, right? And so on. Antigens from our entire body. Because you want these thymic medullary epithelial cells and even dendritic cells, okay? They also present self-antigens on the cell surface. You want these cells to present like as many self-antigens as they can so that you can better train your T cells against your self-antigens, right? For example, if your T cells, actually let's talk about what happens in negative selection, right? What's the role of negative selection? What's the job of it? In negative selection, what's happening is what you're asking is, do our T cells, right, recognize our self-antigens? Would you want your T cells to recognize self-antigens? Right? Obviously, you wouldn't want your T cells to recognize self-antigens because if they did, you would have autoimmunity, right? Your T cells will go and attack your own tissues, which you don't want. That's why negative selection is important. You get rid of T cells that strongly recognize self-antigens, whether that be, so that's why you want self-antigens, right? You want these thymic medullary epithelial cells and dendritic cells to present your self-antigens from your entire body in your medulla of your thymus gland so that you can train your T cells, your immature T cells to recognize, or you can train your immature T cells to not recognize your self-antigens, right? Because think about this, if you have a variety of self-antigens that your thymic medullary epithelial cells and your dendritic cells in your medulla of the thymus gland present, right? So if these cells present a variety of self-antigens, your immature T cells in your medulla of the thymus gland can get trained to a variety of self-antigens, right? And if these T cells recognize any self-antigen, they get destroyed, right? So you would want that because you don't want any T cells that are self-reactive, right, in your body. So these medullary thymic epithelial cells and dendritic cells, they present self-antigen on MHC, and your immature T cells, right, have T cell receptors that bind the self-antigen. But if that happens, and if the T cell receptor binds too strongly with the self-antigen, you get apoptosis. And you want apoptosis to occur in this case, right? Because if this weren't to happen, this same T cell would go into circulation and attack your own tissues, right? Or what else can happen if your T cells recognize self-antigen too strongly in the medulla of the thymus gland is these T cells can get converted to regulatory T cells, right? Because regulatory T cells are good at recognizing self-antigens. This is important because regulatory T cells play a huge role in peripheral tolerance, right? What we're talking about is central tolerance, which occurs in the thymus for T cells and bone marrow for B cells. But regulatory T cells play a hugely important role for peripheral tolerance, which we'll talk about when we talk about IPEX syndrome. Okay. So that's basically what happens in negative selection. But how do the medullary thymic epithelial cells, right? How do they even present self-antigen, right? How do they present self-antigen? And they do that through a very important transcription factor. These medullary thymic epithelial cells, Turns out they need a very important transcription factor in order to even present these self-antigens to our developing T cells. That transcription factor is called AIRE, AIRE, right? This is a very important transcription factor, and what it does is it enables the thymic medullary epithelial cells to present self-antigens. And we said that was really important because that's how you train your developing T cells to not react against your own self-antigens and self-tissue. So that means this AIRE transcription factor is really important so that you really important for not having self-reactive T cells, right? Because without this AIRE transcription factor, your thymic medullary epithelial cells cannot present self-antigens, so you can't train your developing T cells. So that means the AIRE transcription factor is really important. But what is this video on? This video is on autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome, right? In autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome, we said what? It's autosomal recessive disease and it's the mutation in the AIRE gene. So that means you don't have the AIRE transcription factor, which means you can't properly present self-antigens on your thymic medullary epithelial cells. And if you can't present self-antigens on your thymic medullary epithelial cells, you can't do negative tolerance properly, right? So then that means what? You can't train your T cells properly, your developing T cells. You cannot train them, which means what? Your T cells can go to your circulation and be and self-react with your tissues, with your own body tissues, right? So you can get autoimmunity because of this. All right. So in autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome, you don't have proper production of the AIRE transcription factor, which means you cannot present self-antigen on your medullary thymic epithelial cells. If you can't present self-antigen, right, then you can't train your developing T cells to recognize your self-antigen because if these T cells recognize self-antigen, they get destroyed, right, in your thymus gland. But now that can't happen because you're not presenting any self-antigen anymore because of the lack of AIRE transcription factor. So that means self-reactive T cells will escape into circulation and cause autoimmune destruction of tissues. All right. So let's see what that leads to because there's actually a triad we should be familiar with. So again, right, we've already mentioned this. If the AIRE gene is defective, immature self-reactive T cells can't undergo apoptosis, right? Because in order to undergo apoptosis, your immature T cells in your medulla of the thymus gland need to bind self-antigen. And in order to even present self-antigen, right, you need the AIRE transcription factor. So your medullary thymic epithelial cells can present the self-antigen. If you can't do that, you don't present self-antigen, which means your T cells cannot bind self-antigen and cannot get trained. So that means they cannot undergo apoptosis, right? Because there's no self-antigen to bind. So that means there'll be self-reactive T cells in circulation, and then these T cells can go destroy the tissues. So what destroy your own tissues, right? Autoimmunity, autoimmune destruction. So what things can we what findings do we see in autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome? Okay, so let's discuss that. So we have a triad that we should be familiar with. So we get destruction of our parathyroid glands. So it leads to hypoparathyroidism. What do our parathyroid glands release? PTH. What does PTH do? Helps increase your blood calcium. So if you have hypoparathyroidism, you don't release PTH, you don't increase your blood calcium, and you get hypocalcemia. Another finding of the triad is candidiasis, right? Fungal infection. And the last part of the triad is adrenal insufficiency, also called Addison's disease. Okay, and remember your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys, and if those adrenal glands are insufficient, right, you can't secrete cortisol, you can't secrete aldosterone, and you can't secrete certain steroids, right? So so let's see what that leads to. So what would you find? You would find decreased calcium levels if you did labs. Why? because your parathyroid glands are destroyed. So you have hypoparathyroidism, which means you have low PTH. What does PTH do? Increases blood calcium. You don't have PTH, you can't increase blood calcium. You have low blood calcium levels, which is hypocalcemia. What's the other finding we said? We said adrenal gland insufficiency, Addison's disease, right? What do your adrenal glands produce? Remember the first layer of your adrenal glands? We have what? Right? Remember your adrenal glands. We have the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, right? The adrenal cortex is made up of zona fasciculata, right? Zona reticularis and zona glomerulosa, right? So from the top, your first layer, let's do a different color. So remember your adrenal glands, the first layer, right, of your adrenal cortex is your zona glomerulosa. And remember the second layer is the zona fasciculata. Okay. And remember the third layer is what? The zona reticularis. So remember, this makes up your adrenal cortex, right? And your adrenal glands is adrenal cortex plus adrenal medulla. And we know the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine through the chromaffin cells, right? But we'll talk about that later in another video. This is what we need to talk about, these three layers, in order to understand adrenal gland insufficiency. So why do you have low aldosterone in adrenal gland insufficiency, right? Because your zona glomerulosa releases aldosterone. But if you have adrenal gland insufficiency, you can no longer do that, right? So you have low aldosterone levels. Another layer of your adrenal cortex, right, of your adrenal gland is zona fasciculata, the second layer of your adrenal cortex. What does this layer release? Cortisol. But if your adrenal glands are insufficient, you can't release cortisol. And then the third layer we know is the zona reticularis, which releases certain steroids. So if your adrenal glands are insufficient, you may also see decreased steroid production. Okay, so let's go back. So now it should make sense, right? So we have low aldosterone levels. And what do we know? What do we know about aldosterone, right? What does it do in the distal convoluted tubule of the kidneys, right? What it does is, remember, it increases your sodium potassium ATPase channels. What does sodium potassium ATPase do, right? It pumps 3 sodium out and 2 potassium into your cells. So if you have more of these, you're going to reabsorb more sodium and you're going to excrete more potassium, right? So so what did that mean, right? So if you have a lot of aldosterone, if you would have a lot of aldosterone, you would reabsorb a bunch of sodium and excrete a bunch of potassium, right? Remember, this is your sodium, potassium, ATPases function, and aldosterone increases the production of sodium, potassium, ATPases and increases activity, right? But in adrenal insufficiency, you don't have any aldosterone production. So that means you can't reabsorb sodium and you can't excrete potassium in your distal convoluted tubule. So if you can't reabsorb sodium, you would have low sodium levels, and that's called hyponatremia. And if you can't excrete potassium, potassium would build up in your blood, and that's hyperkalemia. Okay, so those findings make sense, right? And what does your zona fasciculata release, right? It releases cortisol. So that's why you would have low cortisol. And we know cortisol is important for maintaining blood glucose levels, right? In times of stress. If you don't have cortisol, you can't maintain proper blood glucose levels, so you can see hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. Okay, and remember, if you have low cortisol, right, and your brain's working fine, then what's that going to lead to? Low cortisol can trigger, right, can trigger your pituitary. So basically, it would be a feedback loop, right? Low cortisol will trigger your pituitary. Your pituitary would be like, okay, well, low cortisol means I need more ACTH, right, in the blood. So your pituitary would release more ACTH. Why? Because what does ACTH do? Right? Remember, ACTH goes to your zona fasciculata, right? And increases cortisol production. That's the job of ACTH. So that's what your pituitary tries to do, right? If you have low cortisol, your pituitary is going to think, okay, if I have low cortisol, let's make more ACTH so that the ACTH can go to the zona fasciculata and have more and produce more cortisol. But the problem is you have adrenal insufficiency. So no matter how much ACTH you produce, right? In Addison's disease, like you have adrenal insufficiency, so your zona fasciculata won't be able to produce cortisol, right? If this is primary adrenal insufficiency, the problem is within your adrenal glands. So your adrenal glands aren't working. So even though you have a bunch of ACTH, your adrenal glands won't work. So you still won't produce cortisol. And that's just going to be a feedback loop cycle, right? So low cortisol will again go to your pituitary, it'll again release ACTH, it'll go to your adrenal glands. Adrenal glands won't be able to secrete cortisol. So then you'll still have low cortisol and and the cycle will continue. That's why you see increased ACTH levels and adrenal gland insufficiency due to low cortisol levels. Okay. Now, another thing to know is remember, your zona glomerulosa is also part of your adrenal glands, right? Adrenal cortex. So if you don't release any aldosterone due to adrenal insufficiency, then remember, what does aldosterone trigger? What's the feedback loop for aldosterone, right? It basically, low aldosterone means it's gonna tell your kidneys to secrete more renin. Okay. And so let's write that down. So low aldosterone, oh, we actually did already write it down, but let's write it down as a loop. So low aldosterone stimulates renin release, right? So it's a feedback loop. So low aldosterone stimulates renin release. That's why if you have low aldosterone levels, you're going to see increased renin levels. And we can even think about it, right? To better remember this. Like, if you have low aldosterone levels, what did we say aldosterone does in the distal convoluted tubules of the kidneys? It increases sodium potassium ATPase channels, right? What does sodium potassium ATPase channels do? It helps pump more sodium outside the cell and potassium inside the cell. So, in the distal convoluted tubules of the kidneys, aldosterone will help pump more sodium outside the cell and into the blood, and more potassium from the blood to inside of the kidney, right? To the tubules, so that you can excrete more potassium in your urine. That's what aldosterone does. So if aldosterone causes more sodium to go from your kidneys to the blood, what follows sodium? Water, right? So aldosterone, therefore, increases blood volume, which means you increase blood pressure, which means aldosterone increases blood pressure. So if you have low aldosterone, you're not reabsorbing any sodium into the blood. So that means you're not reabsorbing much water into the blood, right? In terms of the fact that water follows sodium and aldosterone increases blood volume due to that mechanism. If you have low aldosterone, then not much sodium is getting reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule, which means not much water is following. So your blood volume is low, decreases, right? Due to adrenal insufficiency, because no aldosterone means no sodium reabsorption. No sodium reabsorption means less water reabsorption. Less water reabsorption means lower blood volume. Lower blood volume means lower blood pressure, right? And we know that low blood pressure stimulates your JG cells of your kidneys to release what? Renin. And what does renin eventually do? Increases the production of angiotensin 2. What does angiotensin 2 do? Increases aldosterone production and overall increases blood pressure. So that's why low aldosterone, right, can lead to low blood volume, which can lead to low blood pressure, right? And we know low blood pressure is a big stimulus for renin release. Okay. So that's that finding. So that's basically the triad, okay? Candidiasis, right? So candida infections, hypoparathyroidism, and adrenal insufficiency. That's the triad for autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome type 1. But there's another, like there's a type 2. So there's autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome type 2. And the triad for this would also be adrenal insufficiency, okay? So this is just a quick distinction, right? Adrenal insufficiency, but then you would also see autoimmune attack against your thyroid gland. So for example, Hashimoto's, right? Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and then diabetes. Okay. So you would see, so in autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome type 1, you would see the triad of candidiasis, adrenal insufficiency, and hypoparathyroidism. In autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome type 2, you would see a different triad, right? You would see adrenal insufficiency, but the other two would be different, right? You would see autoimmune thyroid disease like Hashimoto's, for example, and you see diabetes, specifically type 1. Okay. So that's a triad to know for autoimmune polyendocrine syndrome type 2. Okay. And that's basically it for this video. Hope this video wasn't too confusing. Hope this video helped a little bit. Thank you guys for watching and see you guys in my future videos.